Why don't I talk a bit about Labor Day? Because as some people know, and there's a postcard over there with the information on it, I co-authored a book a few years back on the history of Labor Day. So I thought, focus on Labor Day, but also focus on this tradition of marching, because the parade has become the center of Labor Day in Toronto. It wasn't always, but it was always pretty central to what was going on. So I'm going to talk about parades in a very broad sense in how workers and their organizations have used the streets. And I want to start with an image and see if you recognize it. This is forgotten, I think, Bay and whatever, down in the financial district anyway. A good indication of how people wanted to use the streets to communicate. And in this case, they wanted to use their bodies to make a shape. But if you look, it's not a really easy look, but you can see they're also carrying placards and signs and banners and whatnot. So it's a being in the streets in order to have some kind of communication. It's a form of street protest as a form of communication. The earliest form of mass communication, long before we had the mass media as we know it. And that's the first thing to understand about parades. They're more than just entertainment. Yeah, they can be fun to watch, but they're really communications processes trying to convey different kinds of meaning to make us think about the paraders and about the values or the issues that animate them in a particular way. A parade has always been a performance with many elements to it that marchers hoped would make some impression on their fellow townsfolk. This way of communicating had a very long history stretching back centuries, and of course had long been the most effective form of mass communication in societies who couldn't read or read very little. Parades have also been a way of using public space. They developed in cities and towns where people didn't live very far apart, where no one was too far from the center of town and when there wasn't a lot of distance between private and public spaces. Doors of households open onto a busy street of working and shopping and chatting and gossiping and singing and dancing and courtships and fights, where much of life was lived in the streets, almost always on foot. It's what historians have come to call the walking city. Small, compact, close, people saw each other a lot. 150 years ago, many parades took place. Every imaginable kind of group held parades. Almost every week one would pass by your door, certainly through the main streets. It could be a funeral procession, a group of actors promoting a new play, a rowdy band of supporters for a politician, a drunken gaggle of baseball fans celebrating their team's victory. Even back then that happened. All marching right up the middle of the main streets and sometimes down side streets, putting on a kind of performance for all the spectators on the sidewalks. Occasionally, a group of workers might stage some kind of protest in the street to let others in the town know why they were upset. So in 1852, the sewing machine came to the Toronto garment industry. And the tailors of Toronto held a procession through the center of the city, which was a funeral procession, which ended with the burying of the sewing machine. This wasn't going to be any part of their craft. They lost that one. But nonetheless, it was clear that that parade, that procession, was intended to say good riddance to some part of their work experience. There was another kind of group activity in the city that, in the streets that I won't have much to say about. At that time, they were referred to as mobs, who were engaged in riots, and they were invariably some kind of protest by large numbers of people who wanted immediate results. A crowd, that's what we historians now prefer to call them. The crowd would form fairly quickly with no prior organization and no president, vice president, treasurer, and secretary, would be quite noisy, would get violent, but was actually quite well organized and carefully controlled. It had very specific targets. They would march off to particular places to deal with different people, particular people, and so on. It wasn't just smashing windows and moving on. They often used some theatrical elements, such as burning someone in effigy. Strikes often used this form in the 19th century. But unions tended to not like this kind of behavior because it was out of their control. And one of the things that strikes did was to tame those mobs or crowds and turn them into picket lines that were more orderly. Tonight I'm going to concentrate on more formal and more ritualized forms of marching around town. And I'll leave aside that rowdy side. A lot of parades were quite large and well organized in the 19th century. Parades of just wide variety I'm talking about. Sometimes they were part of great civic events like the 1854 Queen's Birthday celebrations. The Victoria Day was called Queen's Birthday back in the 19th century. With processions of ethnic societies, fire companies, military bands, and so on. And I think probably maybe a union local or two. More often, they focused on one particular group or institution, whether it was the military, whether it was fraternal societies like the Odd Fellows, who always marched on July 1st, or the Orange Order, the biggest working class fraternal society in the 19th century, the group that was so opposed to Catholicism and fought the Catholic Irish, or religious groups like the Salvation Army later in the 19th century, or social reform groups like the temperance movement. Political parties also had campaign parades regularly. So the streets are full of these people on a weekly basis. You'd be seeing parades that are being put together by all these different groups for different purposes. There were particular forms to them. They were modeled on the military. They were orderly. Usually you had the Union Jack at the front and you had a marshal, like the guy in the sash at the front. Neat rows of marchers, music to march by in as far as paramilitary fashion, very respectable and very male. Women were never expected to walk in the street. That would have been highly disreputable. That's where the prostitutes were. If there were any women in the parades, they would be up in carriages. There were banners that would be used to highlight and catch people's attention, sometimes with wording on them. The Orange Order had a lot of beautiful banners that put a lot of emphasis on the painting in the middle of the banner. And there was always some sort of costuming that was involved, sashes and badges and whatnot. So this was the set of parading traditions in 19th century Canada, as it was throughout the English-speaking world. The processional culture, if you like. This is what the first labor movement encountered when it decided that it too had something to communicate. The first workers' organizations that emerged in the second half of the 19th century were mostly craft unions, based around one group of skilled workers. There'd be one craft union for each of them in each town or city. And they had their own parading traditions to add on to the mix that were based on their craft traditions going back, in some cases, centuries to the craft guilds in Europe. And they had a tradition of parading to celebrate their crafts and their value of their crafts. So that the shoemakers highlighted St. Crispin, who rode a white horse. The molders highlighted Tubal-Cain, who is a figure in the Bible, and so on. And they would have their own banners. They'd often march with their tools or the products of that they made on display. This was a traditional form that was known at the time as a trades procession. And they happened all through British North America in that period. I don't actually know when the first Toronto trades procession happened. And I'm still searching for that. But we do know the first really big labor parade in Toronto was staged in 1872. This has been repeated often enough that I think most of the people in the room have heard it. There was a struggle going on for the 9 Hours movement that year. This image was created from the Hamilton parade that was held that spring, but there was one in Toronto. It was a political movement. But notice, and this I find myself in constant disagreement with most of the labor movement in Toronto, this was not the beginning of Labor Day. This was a political protest that was going on in which unions came into the streets. Labor Day came in 1882. And that was actually something that this image has been used repeatedly as showing that what was supposed to be the first one in North America in New York City. In actual fact, the one in Toronto happened a few weeks earlier. And it was a day in which It was a brainchild, by the way, of the Knights of Labor, that great organization that existed across North America and other parts of the world in the 1880s. It was intended as a one-day workers' holiday. That was the point. Labor Day was to be a holiday, a festival to celebrate the nobility of labor. And only in 1894 did it finally become a national holiday, the only social group that ever got its own holiday. It was a day that included parades, but also included sports and athletic events, picnics, and speeches. So it was a day in which you were supposed to get it from all sides about how important labor was. All over the country, local labor councils pulled together local unions to put on a show on Labor Day. There was no central coordination, but a basic similarity did appear in what they did. And when Steve Penfold and I did the book many years ago, it was amazing how often the same stories, same forms appeared in city after city, even though they were all locally organized and no one nationally or even in one city would say this is what you should do. From the beginning, Toronto workers made their parade a centerpiece of their day, to draw the city together to see the best features of the new labor movement on display. They had to decide what everyone should wear. It could often be a long, controversial discussion in union meetings, what they should bring with them, whether they should hire a band, whether they should have a horse, and so on. And that led many companies to start offering Labor Day products as commercialization of the event began. What they created was not meant to last very long, unfortunately for us. Much of it would be dismantled, thrown away, or lost. It wasn't unusual to find in union records that a union was trying to find the banner that they had used the last time they marched. It might not have been last year, it might have been 5 years ago, but does anyone know where it is anymore? Or they pull it out of the closet and discover the moths have destroyed it, because they were often silk. It wasn't in very good condition. So these were cultural artifacts and performances that didn't survive very often. Museums and art galleries weren't interested in them, even though they were perhaps the most interesting form of collectively produced working class culture or working class art that existed at the time. I mean, these are workers getting together to collectively put together these performances that were going to march through the streets. Nobody thought it was worth saving them. There had now, of course, is great interest in the antique market and whatever is left, the buttons and the pins and the ones that are all over Carl and Carol's living room walls. And in fact, what we're left with is photographs and drawings as being one of the only ways we actually know what a lot of these parades looked like. And then they're very limited. In the case of Toronto, for reasons that I don't understand, the photographic record before 1930 is extremely slim. And a part of what I hope we're going to find is there's more tucked away in union offices and individuals' households than we found for now. But compared to many other cities, it was hard to find a lot of images from Toronto. You'll see what little there is. When craft unions stepped out onto the streets of Toronto or any other city, they wanted to say a number of things. First, they wanted to insist on their respectability. They weren't ugly, downtrodden beasts. They were respectable men. So they borrowed all the trappings of the mainstream parading traditions. They marched in orderly, military-style fashion, marching with marching bands, swinging their arms like any soldiers, and trying to look as much like a military parade as they could, emphasizing that they were those kind of respectable men. Secondly, they wanted to present the importance of their crafts and to encourage respect for them. So they used banners to convey that, amongst other things. This one was the machinist's banner that was donated by the Ladies' Auxiliary that's gathered there in 1901, I think, Frank? It's about that. And a garment workers banner. They also dressed in similar outfits. Now you're used to seeing maybe a t-shirt or a cap or something. Whoops, didn't go on. This is the Star published this at the turn of the century, and you wouldn't have seen these guys marching like this. What you would have seen was several dozen of the first Boilermakers, then a few dozen of the bakers, and then perhaps 3 or 4 dozen or 50 or 60 of the stonecutters, maybe a similar number, a large number, maybe 100 of the iron molders and the furriers. And in each group, they'd all be dressed the same. They would wrap themselves in particular outfits that in some way might represent what their occupation looked like. If you look at the bakers, you can see pretty clearly the Boilermakers. They often carried their tools. but the idea was they should all look the same and they should have a kind of exclusive look amongst themselves as members of that occupational group as they walked together down the street. A lot more elaborate than just the t-shirt that you might put on now for a Labor Day parade. If they didn't wear as specific outfits, they at the very least put on respectable clothes and the ribbon, which you see a bunch of in Carl and Carol's living room. The so-called allegorical floats were actually fascinating. When I first discovered this, I thought, wow, this was like one of the most exciting things you could see and you no longer ever see in a Labor Day parade. Craftsmen would ride on the backs of wagons making the products. So this is a blacksmith shop, and he's hammering away. The molders would actually make little products and toss them to the crowd. There'd be bakers baking things, tossing them to the crowd. The only instance I found of the brewers actually making stuff, there was quite a crowd following that wagon. Barbers would be shaving faces and cutting hair. All sorts of things that the manual skills of craft labor were on display. And these were, for some reason, called allegories. But they were little performances that molders, bakers, barbers, blacksmiths, and so on used. And of course, to show their well, there's another example as we go forward in time, that there was an attempt to show the equipment that you are working with, some of which is kind of uninspired, But the third point of all this marching was to show your mass strength. This was to put organized labor on display, to get out as large contingents of each occupational group as possible. Sometimes the Labor Council would offer a prize for the largest contingent. And of course, to remind bosses and politicians that they had to be taken seriously. And so, you know, some of these contingents, as they still are, were quite large. And fourthly, they wanted to put their masculine identities on display. They were breadwinners, they were manual laborers, and they looked after their less fortunate women and kids. No women and children appeared in these parades except under very strict and limited circumstances. Women workers very seldom appeared, women wage earners, that is. If they did appear, they had to be in a wagon. As I said earlier, marching in the street was disreputable. These parades, at the turn of the century, were popular. Thousands of people came out to watch. This is Yonge Street, about 1900. The most amazing thing to me is that now for parades, they would push all those people back to the sidewalk, but there are people walking on the parade right down the middle of that crowd. Thousands came out. Newspapers gave them extensive coverage, full reports, float by float, contingent by contingent descriptions in the newspapers of each of the parades that went through. And of course, in 1895, in Toronto, the parade began the tradition of marching into the CNE, where more crowds gathered to watch them. But by that point, all was not well for Labor Day paraders by the early 1900s. The craft union movement was in crisis. It was less important in industry. Fewer resources were being mobilized, were available to mobilize these kind of spectacles. And so over the next century, we'd see labor parades fade away as unions lost their strength and later bounced back again as part of a new wave of organizing and confidence amongst unorganized workers. Labor Day was definitely, and the parading in particular, was on decline by the 1920s and 30s. People were drifting away. And part of this was there was a tension within it from the beginning between the public holiday, which is clearly indicated in this 1896 Labor Day souvenir cover, which has been reproduced quite often, but it's interesting to read it. There is the figure of liberty calling out to workers to come and rise and celebrate. And there's the worker sitting with his kid on the ground saying, "I'm resting." And that's the tension that was there in Labor Day all along. It's between a public holiday and the celebration of labor. Many workers just wanted to do their own thing. The labor movement organized games for family members to draw them out. By the 1920s, actually earlier, by the 1920s when this picture was taken, they were holding baby contests. But there were other commercial attractions appearing on Labor Day to pull workers away, including the CNE itself. But here you could go over to Hanlon's Point and see all sorts of things that are going on to keep you occupied when Hanlon's was still a center of commercial entertainment. The first glimmer of consumerism appeared to get workers to think about getting a new suit for Labor Day, or to enjoy a beer or two, or to buy Mom some canned pork and beans so she could relax as well. So clearly it was being colonized as a way to try and find ways to get workers to spend in their day off. As more and more workers drifted away in search of their own private pleasures, parade organizers began to get worried about filling out the procession. And so they added more and more commercial elements. This, by the way, is a clear echo, or rather the other way around. It's a clear precedent for what's happening in the gay pride parades, with all the discussion about the corporate intervention in those parades that's been going on. You'd had the city sanitation department having their float, no workers in sight, no particular focus on workers. General Motors basically using it as an opportunity to advertise their trucks. And this is probably the most heinous of all. In 1933, the labor movement was so desperate that they put out a call to any company that wanted to put a float in the parade. And this is the point at which Eaton's was one of the most hated employers in Toronto. And they put this thing out that says the reward of labor, inspiration, achievement, and I guess labor is the last word on the other banner. Just unbelievable. I mean, obviously Eaton's thought it was a fantastic way to advertise. And incidentally, in newspapers, companies advertise with this kind of, non-union, anti-union companies advertise with this kind of Labor Day message all the time. Meanwhile, as Labor Day is deteriorating, a different tradition of working class parading had emerged alongside the Labor Day festivities, one that we would now more likely call demonstrations. Workers used the conventions of orderly parading to agitate for some political goal. This is unemployed workers marching down Jarvis Street in 1891, to get some change in public policy rather than just celebrating. Ironically, the craft union, well, there are a couple more examples. Ironically, the craft union movement that had launched Labor Day in the United States in the 1880s had also set in motion another form of mass protest. In 1886, the American Federation of Labor called on workers to use May 1st as a time to demand the 8-hour day. And for several years, unions in the United States held both May Day and Labor Day celebrations. They had May Day demonstrations and Labor Day events that were more celebratory. One was a holiday, the other was politics. That didn't happen so clearly in Canada, but did in the States. Contrary to what I used to, when we first brought the book out, this was the most common question afterwards. We thought Labor Day was a capitalist plot to try and prevent workers from going out on May Day. It's not what happened at all. What did happen was that over the years, the American Federation of Labor and its Canadian equivalents and affiliates got more and more suspicious of the left and didn't want to have anything to do with May Day, and they pulled back from it. So that it became the voice of the left in the workers' movement, and Labor Day was a voice somewhat more often of a more moderate or right-wing tendency within the labor movement. The first May Day in Canada was celebrated in Montreal in 1906, sponsored by socialists, but Toronto didn't have one until the 1920s. It was organized by, not surprisingly, by the Communist Party. The message of May Day was radical. It wasn't that kind of let's all look respectable stuff. Capitalism was bad and should be replaced. That was the persistent message of May Day marches. In form, it was somewhat like the older parades. Orderly lines of marchers, respectable dress. People would put on their best bib and tucker to go out. Women would put on their furs, as I'm sure Esther has noticed. But none of the trappings of the old craft union costuming and ornate banners. There were none of those fancy-looking occupational outfits that I was describing, none of the fancy banners that harkened back to the Middle Ages. Now, more often, there were just simple banners and blunt signs. They also integrated, unlike the Labor Day marches, they integrated the unemployed. Unemployed organizations were encouraged to march in May Day parades. They included unions with left-wing leadership. They included ethnic groups. And they made women welcome as full participants, as well as workers, as workers as well as mothers. They also welcomed children. This is one of my favorite pictures from a May Day march. These are a great group of kids. A couple of, yeah. But I love the signs they're carrying. Now, these were not welcomed by civic authorities the way Labor Day marches had been. And in fact, they were often facing police intervention and disruption by the early 1930s. And yet, these events, as Esther has just tried to remind me, were extremely popular. Especially in the second half of the 1930s, thousands of people came out to watch them. In fact, they basically were vying with Labor Day in terms of numbers of people that showed up. Thousands. But May Day parades took a nosedive in the 1940s. They were hard hit by the politics of the Second World War, which saw the Communist Party flip-flop on the war and then saw harsh public opinion of the Cold War after that. They continued on, and of course still do, but on a much smaller scale. But something else was happening amongst Toronto workers by World War II. A new wave of union organizing had begun, and by the end of the war, plenty of strikes had erupted to make sure that they weren't going to be wiped out again, as they had been after World War I. A lot of this momentum came from industrial unions that wanted to unite all workers in a workplace into a single union, rather than just the practitioners of a specific craft. So the labor movement, as you probably know, was split in the 1940s and first half of the 1950s into industrial and craft branches that in Toronto held their own separate Labor Day parades. And so a new kind of Labor Day parade was born, which contained as much anger as celebration, and which had many other new elements. During the war, the union floats picked up on the themes of wartime propaganda to promote their own struggles for social justice. So you often saw these kinds of floats sponsored by the new industrial unions. It was also clear that they wanted spectators to respect them as workers, but they couldn't put a whole meatpacking plant or a rubber plant on the back of a truck like they could, like the blacksmiths had done earlier. So they emphasized the products that they made. So here, obviously, it's the rubber goods that are being produced. Here it's the paints. They were also more ready to raise much more bluntly some big social and political issues, including post-war unemployment. But notice that these are still not disreputable. They are marching in their best bib and tucker. Not everyone has a tie, but most of them do. They're wearing fedoras in many cases. It's still a time in which you don't dress down, you dress up to go out into the streets. They were ready to take hold of some of the imagery that had up till now been more associated with May Day. They started to incorporate some of those elements from May Day into the Labor Day parades, particularly the capitalist in a top hat. Oh, that's just an enlargement of that. In 1946, the Toronto parade included 3 stock figures of the rich and sensitive politicians. Donald Gordon, chair of the Wartime Prices and Trades Board, C.D. Howe, who was the Minister of Munitions, and Humphrey Mitchell, Minister of Labor, all of whom are here being presented as holding back workers' wages unnecessarily. 2 years later, in 1948, they added the image of the prison to highlight the plight of the Canadian Seamen's Union, who were seen there as being imprisoned, and the Seamen's Union, of course, was in a major battle at that point for its life as The rest of the labor movement let it out to dry, and Canadian state was involved in undermining them. These parades also tried to be more inclusive. They openly denounced racial discrimination, and they gradually made them somewhat more multicultural and slightly less white. In 1952, the UAW at Massey Harris won first prize for this float in its attempt to be multicultural. Now you'll notice that the Japanese woman on the right is probably the only person who isn't European origin, but clearly an attempt to say the labor movement should be open to a wider range. What? Which one? Oh, in the fourth, yes. Possibly. The actual dress doesn't look like a native outfit, though. Anyway, we can dissect that at some other time. The sleeping car porters, an all-black union, finally joined the parade in 1956. And then in 1960, the Italian construction workers that had risen up in revolt and just completely swept through the residential construction industry in 60. There were some ugly stereotypes that hung on. Innocent children dressed as Hollywood Indians, still perpetuating myths about indigenous peoples. Perhaps the most interesting and complex new development was the way that women were included in these parades. They were there. They hadn't been excluded like they were in the old parades. A few appeared as auxiliaries in their traditional role, and this was one that was very dressed up in very fancy outfits. But during the war, women got a chance to present themselves as real wage earners, appearing in the uniforms they wore in the plants where they'd been hired in large numbers during the early years of the 1940s. Textile workers. But increasingly, they were also presented as pretty sexual objects in skimpy clothing, starting with the drum majorettes and then continuing on many union floats, where unnecessarily short dresses, unnecessarily skimpy tops, and unnecessarily tight upper body clothing. This is NUPKI, right? The predecessor of PSAC. Now this one. What union to imagine? This was the Allied printing trades, which had no women in their ranks to speak of at all. What does she have to do with that? Nothing more than a sexual bauble to attract attention. Some of the unions, some of the labor councils and unions started to hold their own beauty contests. We're not talking anymore about bread and roses so much as cheesecake and daffodils. Labor didn't invent this sexist imagery in the 1950s. The whole of North American culture was saturated with it, in advertising, on television, and every other parade that was held in this period. But labor didn't challenge it either. They incorporated it instead. There were a few other surprising changes in the look of Labor Day parades, mostly drawn from a new kind of colorful parading that emerged in the first half of the 20th century. Exotic circus parades had been around for a while. In 1905, the Santa Claus Parade had started under the sponsorship of the T. Eaton Company. And these offered more fanciful characters on more colorful floats. They brought in figures from popular culture, including cowboys. Perhaps and most importantly, they made clowns central to all parading. So Labor Day began to have more and more of them. Some people with high-minded principles thought this was all frivolous and detracted from labor's message. But another way to look at it is that they were drawing on the new parading traditions with a sprinkling of clowns and cowboys and beauty queens to make a public spectacle that would draw lots of attention to their other messages. And those other messages were definitely there. Medicare and pensions, for example, which were usually featured in the same parades as the glitz and glamour. Whatever your take on these new developments, there's no doubt that by the 1960s and 70s, unions were having trouble getting their members to march through the streets, no matter how many clowns you added. And there were several reasons for this. Cities were changing. They were much bigger, more impersonal. Many more people had moved to the suburbs. So it was harder to have a parade to reach everybody. Remember, as I said at the beginning, this is a mode of communication that's based on people living relatively close together. But now they're spreading out more than ever. It's not much fun to parade through empty streets, as some folks going along Queen Street on Labor Day have sometimes commented. Mass communication had changed, the print media, but also broadcasting. There was one story we found, it wasn't in Toronto, of an attempt to actually broadcast a Labor Day parade, but it obviously hadn't worked because they never tried it again anywhere else. Labor was, of course, a victim of its own success. They'd won shorter hours in the 1940s and 50s, the 40-hour week, paid vacations, long weekends, so people wanted to get away. And labor was making it easier for them to do so, to have a holiday. And so a new kind of parade developed, the traffic jam on highways. Labor Day became associated with the end of summer more than as a labor-oriented event. If you didn't escape from the city on Labor Day weekend, the chances were good that you were focused on work around the house, and advertisers were ready to help you do that. In many cities, local labor movements decided to quietly cancel the parades as people were just not showing up and concentrated on picnics instead. They didn't abandon the celebration of Labor Day, but they found that parading wasn't really appropriate. But not Toronto. In fact, this annual event got revitalized in this city as the 1970s saw a new resurgence of labor militancy. Governments introduced policies that seemed to attack and undermine, notably the wage control program of 1975. Parades got much more serious, shed the clowns and the beauty queens, and got more political. A lot of that new energy, of course, came from the public sector, who had jumped into the labor movement big time starting in the late 60s, and were soon some of the biggest unions involved. This is OPSU in 1986. And there was incredible new energy coming from the women's movement, which in the 1970s started their own marches to celebrate International Women's Day on March 8th. Unions started to attend those marches as well, as they recognized that this was a significant part of their membership and they needed to address it. The biggest labor protest in this city that the city had ever seen, of course, happened in 1996, when roughly 250,000 people marched on Queen's Park to protest the new right-wing turn that the Harris Conservative government had made in Ontario, weakening labor legislation, cutting social funding, and so much more. It was part of 11 such actions in different cities across the province between 1995 and 1998. I love that picture. When we were there that day, you could never get a full sense of just what 250,000 people looked like. Or as Steve Penfold, my co-authors, used to say, who are all these people coming to hear Billy brag? Yes, probably more. In many ways, the spirit of that huge demonstration continues on in the labor parades of the early 2000s, including the one that happened last week. Visually, things look different than they once did. People dress more casually, though often with the same t-shirt and baseball cap, trying to provide some unity for particular locals. But they don't march in tight military formation anymore. In fact, they kind of amble all over the place. There are still a few of the traditional banners, but many more of what's carried are mass-produced signs and colorful flags. There are still floats of various kinds, but they're generally simpler. But the faces look different. There are many more people of color, reflecting how Toronto has changed over the past half century. You'll find healthcare workers, teachers, nurses, hotel employees, even librarians. And you'll still find a few clowns, not very many, and a heck of a lot of children. Usually, this is one of the construction unions' little ambit couple of years ago. But usually they're walking with their parents. It's a much more family-oriented march in that way. But there are also thousands of people who share this woman's commitment and her willingness to get out on the streets and deliver a message, just the way that the first labor paraders did a century and a half ago. Thank you.